Jho Low had more spending power than just about anyone on earth.
One of the biggest heists in history.
Jho Low just stole billions of dollars.
One of the biggest frauds.
Corruption cases ever.
He gets to know Leonardo DiCaprio, build a Hollywood empire. They make the Wolf of Wall Street with the stolen money, and nobody knows the truth about him.
This is Jho Low. He's one of the most wanted men in the world after stealing around $4.5 billion, one of the biggest scams in history that he pulled off whilst in his 20s. And that money wasn't tied up in assets. This was liquid cash which he could spend, meaning Jho Low probably had more spending power than anyone else on Earth. And boy, did he enjoy that money. Jho Low built a reputation as one of the top spenders in casinos and nightclubs, often splurging hundreds of thousands of dollars on drinks per night. He bought private jets and mansions and Picasso artworks, and lived an extraordinary life of partying and luxury. Honestly, his life resembled something out of The Wolf of Wall Street, which is ironic, because it was Jho Low who financed that movie. Yep, Jho Low used stolen money from his financial scam to fund the Hollywood blockbuster about a financial scam. But how does a guy born on a small Malaysian island end up becoming friends with Hollywood stars, dating supermodels, and pulling off one of the biggest financial frauds ever? Welcome to the insane true story of Jho Low. Jho Low was born in the Malaysian island of Penang, but in 1998, Jho Low's parents sent him to Harrow, a prestigious boarding school in England. Jho Low would later reflect on this and say, "That time was very important for me. That's when I built the core foundation of contacts for the future." You see, whilst Jho Low's family were wealthy, many of Joe's classmates at Harrow were a whole different level of wealth. Many of them were children from royal families or oil magnates, so whilst Joe was the son of a millionaire, many of the people he was now hanging around with were the sons of billionaires. But Jho Low sensed an opportunity here and tried to build friendships with some of these extremely wealthy students. To try and impress them, he invited them to spend a summer in Malaysia, and he then borrowed a 160-foot yacht from a rich family friend and pretended it was his own yacht by changing all the family photos on board to pictures of him. He wanted his super rich friends to believe he was one of them. Jho Low also tried to position himself as a person who could get stuff done for people. He once managed to get the letterhead of the Brunei embassy and forged a letter to a very famous nightclub in the West End asking if they could reserve a VIP table by pretending he was a member of the Brunei royal family. And it worked. Jho Low and his underage friends went partying alongside famous football players and models in this high-end nightclub. It was an early lesson for Jho Low that the appearance of power and prestige could unlock all kinds of doors. After Harrow, Jho Low went to Wharton University in America, and he was continually trying to build his personal brands. For example, he wrote articles on stocks for the Wharton Journal, his university's newspaper. However, Jho Low was just copying reports written by Wall Street analysts and pretending they were his own. But somehow nobody noticed Jho Low was just plagiarizing these articles, and thus he developed a reputation as a great stock picker despite actually having no experience. Jho Low also drove a Lexus convertible around campus that he claimed he'd bought, but was really just leasing. And he deliberately didn't correct rumors he was a prince of Malaysia. Jho Low was essentially building a persona to help get him in the right social circles. He'd figured out who the wealthiest students at the university were, and then actively pursued friendships with them, just like he'd done at Harrow. Jho Low's ability to network so well would ultimately be what allowed him to pull off one of the greatest financial heists ever. So, whilst at university, Jho Low decided to throw a massive luxury party for his birthday that year, and he rented out an exclusive nightclub with an open bar and sent out invites with his name written in large fonts. Whilst Jho Low definitely enjoyed partying, to him, the whole thing was more of an investment. He wanted to appear successful and make sure everyone remembered him, so he made sure the whole event had a very exclusive feel to it, so that every attendee felt important. However, what the party attendees didn't realize is that Jho Low had only put down a deposit for the party, and after the event, he was stalling on paying the club owners the rest of the money that they'd been promised. You see, even though Jho Low regularly got sent money from his father, he didn't actually have enough money to pay for the entire event. So he ended up stalling for months and eventually negotiating a massive discount with the club owners. But it didn't matter. None of the party attendees knew this. They just assumed he was as rich as he said he was. And thus, Jho Low's plan was working. He was making friends with very influential people and building up a reputation. Jho Low fully bought into the idea that it's not just what you know, it's who you know. And he was happy to lie about who he was and how much money he had in order to get in with the right people. Using these new connections, Jho Low managed to persuade some of his Arab friends he'd made to set up a tour around the Middle East, where he then met with some of the richest families and made more influential connections, including some minor royals. One of them later commented how Jho Low seemed particularly interested about power structures in the Middle East, that he seemed to be trying to understand who controlled the money in each country. However, However, one of the most important connections of all that Jho Low made was with the people who ran Abu Dhabi's sovereign wealth fund. Now, quick side note, what the hell is a sovereign wealth fund? Well, it's essentially a giant pool of money that's controlled by a nation's government. Most commonly, they're used by countries that are dependent on a single resource, like countries in the Middle East whose economies are highly dependent on oil, and they use these funds to diversify their money into other assets and investments. However, these sovereign wealth funds have so much cash and are mostly unregulated with very little transparency or oversight. And that's why they would be crucial for Jho Low's future schemes. But first, after essentially going on a networking tour around the Middle East, Jho Low returned to university to graduate. And it was at that point Jho Low set up his own company, which he called the Win-Ton Group. He told friends that he'd chosen the name because he was going to win tons of money. Seriously. The basic idea behind the company was that he'd broker deals between Middle Eastern investors who wanted to get involved in projects in Malaysia. So Jho Low got luxurious offices for this new company in the famous Petronas Towers, which he couldn't really afford, but he managed to arrange a loan from a local bank because Jho Low knew it was important to give off the perception this was a serious and successful business. Of course, he now needed some actual clients. And luckily for Jho Low, all of his networking with wealthy elites was about to start paying off in a very major way. One of Jho Low's best friends from his days at Harrow was Riza Aziz, who was the stepson of a prominent Malaysian government official called Najib Razak. In fact, by the time Jho Low had started his company up, Najib had become Deputy Prime Minister of Malaysia, which obviously meant he had a lot of power, and Jho Low knew there could be some huge advantages for him if he could get inside Najib's inner circle. Of course, just being good friends with Najib's stepson wasn't enough by itself. Jho Low had to prove his value. And that's when Jho Low heard that Malaysia was looking for partners to develop a giant construction project. The idea for it was basically to build a financial and lifestyle centre similar to Singapore, but they needed investors. Jho Low saw an opportunity here. Using the wealthy connections he'd made in the Middle East, he was able to broker a deal where they would invest in Malaysia's construction project. But here's the crucial part. Jho Low let Najib, Malaysia's Deputy Prime Minister, take all the credit for the deal, despite not having to do any of the work. This massively boosted Najib's popularity with the Malaysian people, as he was now seen as a politician who could attract big investments and help propel Malaysia forwards. In fact, this popularity he gained was one of the factors in helping him become Prime Minister of Malaysia in 2009. Now, Jho Low's original business model was that he'd simply get a fee for brokering these kinds of deals, but he didn't actually get a fee for this construction project. Instead, Jho Low got something better. He was now loved by Najib, who was extremely grateful to Jho Low. And so, in 2009, when Najib became Prime Minister of Malaysia, it meant Jho Low, who at this point was just 27 years old, now had the ear of the most powerful man in the country. And Jho Low didn't stop there. He tried to fully embed himself into Najib's family. He bought Najib's wife expensive jewelry, and even paid for Najib's daughter's college tuition, as well as attending her graduation ceremony. By this point, Najib trusted Jho Low fully, and so after Najib was sworn in as Prime Minister of Malaysia, Jho Low wasted no time in approaching him with an idea. Jho Low said Malaysia should create their own sovereign wealth fund, similar to the ones in the Middle East, which could be used to invest all around the world. And so together, they set up the One Malaysia Development Berhad, or the 1MDB Fund for short. Now officially, the 1MDB fund was supposed to develop the country's economy. It would supposedly be used to invest in green energy and tourism and create high quality jobs for all Malaysians. But Jho Low explained to Najib that if he put him in charge of the fund, they could use some of the money as a war chest to fund Najib's political goals. For example, the fund could be used for Najib to host big events, or to build affordable housing in areas where Najib hadn't received many votes in the election, as a way to get more of the country loyal to him. Jho Low had the Malaysian Prime Minister in the palm of his hand. He'd helped Najib get elected, and now he was proposing a deal to help Najib consolidate power even further. To Najib, the whole idea seemed like a win-win. So, Najib let Jho Low run the 1MDB fund and do whatever he wanted with basically no oversight. Officially, Najib had the title of the fund's chairman, whilst Jho Low was simply classed as an advisor. But in reality, Jho Low controlled the whole fund, and he hired people he knew well as staff who were blindly loyal to him. Meaning, Jho Low essentially had full control over what to do with Malaysia's billion-dollar fund. Within a couple of months, Jho Low had found the first deal for the 1MDB fund to invest in. Using connections Jho Low had made in Saudi Arabia, he'd arranged a joint venture with the oil company Petro Saudi. The plan was that 1MDB would invest $1 billion into this oil project, which was basically all the money in the fund at the time. But Jho Low got permission from Najib to transfer the money from 1MDB's account, since Najib was happy to trust Jho Low fully. However, since Jho Low was fully in charge of the money, he actually only sent $300 million to the joint venture account with Petro Saudi, whilst the remaining $700 million went to a company called Goodstar Limited, which had a bank account in Switzerland. Jho Low claimed that Goodstar Limited was a company owned by the Saudis, and said that 1MDB had to send the money to Goodstar as part of the deal, because of a debt they had to pay before the joint venture could continue. But this wasn't true. This Goodstar Limited was merely a shell company, and it used something called bearer shares. Now, with normal shares in a company, they'd be registered to an individual's name, and there'd be a registry of who owns shares in the company. However, a bearer share is a type of share where whoever holds the physical share certificate has full ownership of it, thus making it very hard to tell who really owns the company, and therefore making it very useful for frauds. In the case of Goodstar Limited, it was later revealed that there was only one physical share, and that share was held by Jho Low. In other words, Jho Low had just sent $700 million from the 1MDB fund to Goodstar Limited's bank account, and Jho Low owned 100% of Goodstar Limited's. So on paper, it seemed like 1MDB had simply invested in the Petro-Saudi joint venture as planned, but in reality, Jho Low had just paid himself $700 million. In many ways, it was such an incredibly simple move, but it was the meticulous planning to get to this position of power in the first place that had made it possible. From an early age, Jho Low had been actively seeking the right connections, and then providing value to those connections in order to cultivate such an influential and powerful network who trusted him. He'd identified sovereign wealth funds as a tool that could be easily exploited, and once he'd got the Malaysian Prime Minister to grant him full power of the 1MDB fund, siphoning off money for his own personal gain had been relatively straightforward. He just had to bribe a few senior people for their silence, but that wasn't hard to do when he just got $700 million and had deliberately surrounded himself with loyal yes men. And now, it was time for the real fun to begin. Jho Low had successfully taken money from the Malaysian fund and funneled it to Swiss bank accounts under the guise it was an investment, and he'd then used friends in high-ranking positions to make sure nobody questioned anything. Jho Low now had hundreds of millions of dollars sat in a bank account. This is very different to most rich people whose wealth is heavily tied up in company stock or investments, but for Jho Low, it was all available to spend, and he could do whatever he wanted with it. So, with all of this stolen money, Jho Low began living a life of luxury. He went on a spending spree of yachts, mansions, and sports cars. He even bought a big hotel in Beverly Hills. But most nights, you'd find Jho Low at an exclusive nightclub or casino. In fact, it's reported that in the 8 months between October 2009 and June 2010, Jho Low and his friends spent around $85 million on private jets, alcohol, gambling, and paying models and Hollywood celebrities to party with them. It was non-stop partying and networking. You see, Jho Low realized he could use the money from 1MDB to get close to the rich and famous, and build an even greater reputation for himself. And thus, he put the word out in show business circles that he was happy to pay celebs over $100,000 a night to attend his parties. Even to rich celebrities, they'd never seen anything quite like Jho Low's levels of spending. This was a whole different level of rich. He'd lose $1 million in a game of poker and wouldn't seem to care. As a result, Jho Low got to meet all kinds of famous people. For example, Jho Low had fantasized about Paris Hilton since his college days. Now he was regularly hanging out with her. There's also stories of Jho Low being in a Las Vegas hotel suite with Leonardo DiCaprio, surrounded by 20 Playboy bunnies. Jho Low would also buy out prestigious clubs and then throw secret parties with friends and celebrities. He'd give out incredibly expensive gifts, like he gave Kim Kardashian a white Ferrari for a wedding. And he'd casually hand out designer bags that cost tens of thousands of dollars to people he'd literally just met. And to be fair, Jho Low threw some of the biggest parties imaginable. There was one particular party he threw in Vegas for his birthday that felt more like a major concert. Had all kinds of celebrities, including Kanye West, Bradley Cooper, Robert De Niro, Michael Phelps, Kim Kardashian, Paris Hilton, and even Psy was there to sing Gangnam Style. Oh, and he even got Britney Spears to burst out of a cake to serenade him by singing Happy Birthday. That single night is rumored to have cost tens of millions of dollars. Most of the celebrities at these events were often being paid to be there. The truth is, even the biggest stars didn't turn down hundreds of thousands of dollars to attend an event. However, they had to admit, Jho Low knew how to throw an amazing party. And Jho Low felt if his parties were successful, his own status would grow, helping him attract even more powerful people into his life. And he was indeed getting a reputation. When newspapers heard he'd sent 23 bottles to Lindsay Lohan's table on a night out, they dubbed him the big spending Malaysian, the mystery man of the city club scene. And being surrounded by celebrities of course raised Jho Low's profile further, and at one point he reportedly dated the model Miranda Kerr, who he showered with expensive gifts. But the insanity didn't stop there. For example, for New Year's, Jho Low said he wanted to experience it twice. So Jho Low, along with some friends and celebrities, got on a private plane and flew to Sydney in Australia. Then, after celebrating New Year's once, they flew back to Las Vegas in order to celebrate the countdown to midnight a second time in the same night. There was also another incident where Jho Low got into a bidding war with someone for a bottle of champagne and ended up spending €2 million on it. Some even started calling Jho Low the Asian Great Gatsby. But this wasn't just a reference to him throwing so many expensive, over-the-top parties. It was also because Jho Low seemed to observe his own parties, rather than be actively involved in them. He'd sort of be watching on, and repeatedly checking with people if they were having a good time and enjoying it, rather than actually enjoying it himself. Many of his guests tried to speak with him, but the conversations never seemed to get very far beyond small talk. He actually seemed quite shy, but he clearly had an overwhelming desire to please people. One attendee even commented that it felt fake, as if we were just there to go through the motions and entertain and look cool as a group, rather than actually have fun. It was ultimately about the pretense of wealth, prestige, and status. However, back then, if you searched for Jho Low on Google, very little came up. He was still shrouded in mystery, and people were left to speculate how he got so rich. Some thought he was an arms dealer, or that he was descended from royalty, but despite the party playboy reputation, Jho Low's closest friends nicknamed him Panda, which they said was because he was plump and cuddly. For years, Jho Low methodically cultivated relationships with the wealthiest and most powerful people on the planet. But he also tried to learn what motivated them and see how he could assist them. So far, the stolen money from 1MDB had been spent on the lavish lifestyle of Jho Low, along with some of it going to a political slush fund for Najib, the Malaysian Prime Minister. But Jho Low now wanted to use some of the money to start a legitimate business. Since Jho Low loved the LA lifestyle, he decided he wanted to get involved in Hollywood himself, and helped fund a production company called Red Granite Pictures. Just like with the 1MDB fund, Jho Low didn't take an official title at the company, as he didn't want records of his involvements. He preferred to be the secret money man behind it, having an active role from the shadows. Around this time, Jho Low heard that DiCaprio and Scorsese wanted to make a film about the Wolf of Wall Street, but couldn't get any of the major Hollywood studios to give them the $100 million budget they needed to make the film. The studio said it was too risky to spend that much on a film that would get R-rated and thus a reduced audience. So instead, Jho Low's production company helped finance the movie and gave DiCaprio and Scorsese full creative control over it. As a result, Jho Low himself was personally named in the film's credits. Plus, when Leo won a Golden Globe for his role in the movie, he gave Jho Low a shout out in his acceptance speech.
Thank Joey, Riz, and Joe. Thank you for being not only collaborators, but taking a risk on this movie, truly.
Jho Low had made his first big move into Hollywood. Although there is an obvious irony that a film like The Wolf of Wall Street would essentially be financed with stolen money, especially given the crazy partying lifestyle of the guy who funded it. What's really interesting though, is that the real-life guy that The Wolf of Wall Street is based on, Jordan Belfort, didn't trust Jho Low at all. Belfort was invited to one of Jho Low's parties to celebrate them buying the rights to his story. However, Belfort commented that something didn't seem right when he saw how overly extravagant the event was, and he said, "You wouldn't spend money you work for like that. This has got to be stolen." However, most people around Jho Low were happy not to ask too many questions, and so Jho Low's company later acquired a stake in EMI Music Publishing, and he even joined the firm's advisory boards. Between the Wolf of Wall Street movie and the EMI deal, Jho Low was putting himself on the map as more than just a guy who threw big parties. Jho Low's intention now was to build a media empire that would become a legitimate, profitable business. Jho Low figured eventually he might be making so much money from his media projects that he could repay the money he'd taken out of the 1MDB fund. At the very least, Jho Low knew he needed some kind of income to try and sustain his very expensive new lifestyle. The problem was, Jho Low had a compulsion to keep spending and acquiring more and more. He wanted to keep making things bigger and crazier. And so, Jho Low realized he was going to need more money fast, which meant it was time to steal some more. Before we get to the next chapter, have you noticed how many massive companies are now using crypto? Even luxury fashion brands like Gucci. And since the beginning of 2021, the capitalization of the cryptocurrency market has exceeded $1 trillion for the first time in its 12-year history. Well, if you're looking to trade Bitcoin, Ethereum, or other cryptos yourself, you're gonna wanna check out our video sponsor, Waves Exchange, a crypto trading platform with a ton of great features. Firstly, you can buy crypto with your card in just a couple of clicks, or from a convenient app with fast deposits and withdrawals. referrals. And since it's a decentralized exchange, your crypto is actually yours. Secondly, you can also stake your crypto and earn passive income. And thirdly, even if you're not looking to invest in crypto right now, you can still earn money by referring people who are, thanks to Waves' referral program. So no matter whether you're looking to buy or sell crypto with low transaction fees, or you're looking to earn passive income, check out Waves.exchange. They've been around since 2016 and had over $270 million invested already, and it's really easy to get started. Just click the link in the description below now. Tim Leissner was head of Goldman Sachs' Asia division, and Jho Low had been wooing him. He'd arranged for a private jet to come and pick Tim up, and then taken him to a meeting with one of the richest sheiks in the world. After giving Tim an extremely luxurious trip, Jho Low explained his intentions, that he wanted Goldman Sachs to help 1MDB raise more money through bond sales. The truth was that Jho Low knew that they needed the credibility of a big Wall Street bank like Goldman Sachs to ensure the whole thing looked legitimate. So they made a deal where Goldman Sachs would issue a bond and sell that bond to investors. Now, investors were told that their money would help pay for power plants. But the problem was, 1MDB had no credit rating, which made it very hard to convince people to invest. So to make the power plant deals look better, Goldman Sachs used their credibility and paired 1MDB up with Abu Dhabi's sovereign wealth fund, which had $70 billion in assets and solid credits. Suddenly, the package looked much more enticing to investors. 1MD by itself wasn't that appealing, but 1MDB mixed with Abu Dhabi's wealth fund, plus with Goldman Sachs involved, that was enough for investors to buy into these bonds. In 2012, 1MDB issued $3.5 billion in bonds through Goldman Sachs. But as the official fund manager, Jho Low used his old offshore tricks that he'd used before and diverted $1.4 billion of that money to an offshore company registered in the British Virgin Islands, which was another tax haven. Then in 2013, 1MDB issued $3 billion more bonds through Goldman Sachs, and Jho Low once again diverted some of the funds through offshore accounts. So instead of that investor money going to power plants as advertised, Jho Low had been siphoning billions of dollars into more shell companies which he controlled. He also used some of that money to pay off everyone who had helped him pull this off, including Tim Leissner from Goldman Sachs, but the rest was Jho Low's to keep. Jho Low now had billions of dollars in his offshore accounts, which allowed his crazy spending to continue, or if anything, get crazier. Famous art, massive houses, and of course, yet more gambling and partying. A big kickback also went to Najib to keep the Prime Minister happy and make sure he didn't ask too many questions. Plus, Jho Low figured the money from the bond sales would help cover 1MDB's growing losses. As for Goldman Sachs, they got around $600 million in fees and revenue, which reporters later said is around 200 times more than they'd usually make on a deal that size, indicating they knew full well something very shady was going on, but didn't ask any questions in return for a big payout. Because remember, without Goldman Sachs getting involved and giving their experience and reputation to the bonds, there's no way 1MDB would have been able to raise so much money. But still, how did Jho Low actually manage to siphon off billions of dollars for himself? Firstly, one strategy was setting up bank accounts under fake company names that resembled real firms. For example, they created a shell company called BlackRock Commodities Global Limited, which sounds just like the giant global investment company BlackRock. So it was easy for anyone looking at the transaction to assume the money was being sent to genuine big companies, so it didn't raise any obvious red flags, when in reality, they were just fake shell companies with very similar names. Another strategy Jho Low used is called layering, moving funds from one offshore bank account to another, making them look like real transactions or loans, and adding layers of complexity until the original source of the funds is hidden, as it's very hard to track these offshore accounts registered in tax havens. Jho Low also had another scheme where he transferred money to trust accounts at US law firms, because client confidentiality rules in the US mean those accounts are hardly regulated. But most importantly of all, Jho Low was able to pull this off because he knew that transactions between governments attracted a lot less scrutiny from auditors and banks. Government funds are simply not as transparent as with a regular company. As a result of all this, it's estimated in total that around $4.5 billion was stolen from 1MDB. Jho Low treated the fund that was meant to help Malaysia as his personal bank account. Of course, Najib, the Malaysian Prime Minister, knew full well that 1MDB wasn't as legitimate as it seemed, because he was receiving secret money from the fund for his own political ambitions. However, Jho Low had promised him that the fund would enhance relationships with the Middle East and help bring investment and developments in Malaysia. So Najib didn't think Jho Low would literally just steal so much of the money. Then again, giving Jho Low completely unregulated power over a multi-billion-dollar fund was always going to be very risky. But still, back in Malaysia, people were starting to ask more questions about the 1MDB fund. Like, what was happening with all that money? Why wasn't Malaysia getting all the developments they'd been promised? Luckily for Jho Low, he still had the Prime Minister Najib on his side, so he wasn't in any danger. Of course, the reason he had the Prime Minister on his side was that Jho Low was still funneling a lot of that stolen money into financing Najib's political campaigns, including money to throw massive events or give to charity to make Najib look good. So 1MDB continued to burn through money. In fact, it went several billions of dollars into debt. And then in 2015, a whistleblower leaked emails to the press, which included key information which would bring Jho Low's schemes to light and help the world realize the full scale of the scam Jho Low had pulled off. The emails caused more people to dig into what was happening, and soon it started to become clearer about the scam that had taken place. Hundreds of thousands of Malaysian citizens took to the streets to protest and demand that Najib resign for his involvement in the 1MDB fund. But he didn't resign. Najib thought by the time of the next election, it would have all blown over. For Jho Low, as allegations about what he'd done started to come out in the media in 2015, he realized he was going to have to go into hiding. Jho Low still had vast amounts of cash, so he'd still be able to live an extremely comfortable life, but just very isolated, which he hated. He didn't even like being by himself in his room. It was also around this time that his girlfriend Miranda Kerr broke up with him. Then, in May 2018, Najib had a shock election defeat and was voted out, with his party losing for the first time in 60 years. In fact, it was the first regime change in Malaysia's entire history, which just shows how understandably angry the Malaysian people were at the corruption that had taken place. Right after the election, Najib and his wife attempted to flee the country, but protesters at the airport stopped them. Najib claimed he was simply leaving the country for a golf trip. But it was obvious Najib knew what was coming now that he was no longer in power. Shortly after this, police raided Najib's house and found $274 million worth of goods, including endless amounts of expensive jewelry, handbags, tiaras and watches, along with $28 million in cash. It was clear Najib had been bribed. Anti-corruption officials arrested the former prime minister in his mansion. He was convicted of multiple crimes and sentenced to 12 years in prison. But he's currently appealing, claiming these were all genuine political donations. And in the meantime, he's still part of the representative arm of the government. But as for Jho Low, he was long gone. He disappeared. Some sources suggested he'd gone to live in China and could be residing in a villa owned by a high-ranking Chinese party official. There's even reports he was briefly spotted at a Victoria's Secret party in Shanghai, suggesting he's still trying to live out the party lifestyle, albeit much more low-key than he would want. As for Tim Leisner, the ex-Goldman Sachs manager who helped 1MDB, he pled guilty to conspiracy to commit bribery and money laundering. Whilst Goldman Sachs tried to say it was just a few rogue employees who'd been involved in helping 1MDB launder money, in Tim's guilty plea, he said that avoiding compliance was part of the Goldman Sachs culture. Ultimately though, the people who suffered most in all this were the Malaysian people, who were left with all the debts. 1MDB was sold as development projects that would be of benefit to all Malaysian people, but in reality, it was a cash grab, a big betrayal of the people. Billions of dollars of Malaysian government money had been stolen and disappeared into a hidden labyrinth of offshore bank accounts and shell companies. Even to this day, the FBI is still trying to piece everything together, and that is money that could have genuinely helped a lot of people. Now, it's important to state that pretty much everyone involved, from Jho Low to Najib to Goldman Sachs, all deny they did anything wrong. What is clear is this scam was an example of how the financial system can be so easily manipulated. Powerful people and big banks are incentivized not to ask too many questions as long as they're making money on these deals. And perhaps most crazy of all, Jho Low technically is still a free man, and you could say he got away with it. But there are many countries he can no longer visit, and he has no choice but to lay low, the exact opposite of what he wanted to do. Reports suggest that towards the end of this, Jho Low had gone from being quite a happy, relaxed guy to being very anxious and paranoid. And the truth is, even when he was living what many would describe as an ultimate fantasy, being so rich, partying with movie stars and models on jets and yachts, Jho Low never seemed truly happy in the moment, at least not according to those who met him. He seemed desperate to be liked and respected, which is perhaps why he kept chasing more and more money, instead of quitting while he was ahead, which ultimately led to his downfall. Now, whilst the story of Jho Low is pretty mad, I still wouldn't call him the craziest billionaire. For that, you're going to want to check out the ridiculous and inspiring story of Masayoshi Son. And you can click right here to watch that mini documentary now. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next video right here. Cheers.